Good afternoon and welcome back to the final session of our conference. Yes, you will immediately see that I am not Katja Adler. Following the death of Silvio Berlusconi, Katja has been summoned by her BBC bosses to Rome, so I am taking her place, and apologies in advance for that. But we are finishing off today's conference with what we bill as a high-level discussion, certainly being a civilized conversation because it involves two distinguished diplomats. I'd like to invite to the screen Pedro Serrano, the European Union Ambassador to the United Kingdom. Welcome, Pedro, Ambassador.
Very much. Pleasure.
And Lindsay Appleby, the UK's Ambassador to the European Union. Welcome, Ambassador. Welcome, Lindsay.
Good afternoon.
So this is going to be very interactive. We have half an hour also to have this conversation. Invite questions from the audience, as always. Please use the chat function as for the previous sessions, and I'll do my very best to bring them into the conversation. So let's start, gentlemen. I can imagine that you two speak quite a lot, but not necessarily with several hundred people listening in and watching you, as is going to be happening for the next half an hour. So let's see what this brings, this kind of two-way chat. I'm going to start with probably one of the most difficult, maybe sensitive questions, but the elephant in the room, frankly, in EU-UK relations, which is the question of trust. Much has been said about the absence or the degradation of trust historically, going back since the Brexit vote 7 years ago. And we all know many versions of why that was the case, to what extent that was the case. But let's look forward, I suppose, to the future, and let's be constructive and positive, as the EUUK Forum's vocation always is. I'll ask each of the same questions. Start off with Pedro. How would you characterize the current state of EUK relations in terms of the levels of trust, frankly?
Thank you very much, and a pleasure to be here, Paul, and of course to discuss with Lindsay, which I do, as you said, quite frequently. And that's part also of the trust, actually, the trust that I have with Lindsay, and that I hope he also has with me. And there was a breach of trust, particularly around or symbolized or by the Northern Ireland Protocol and its implementation. And at some point, the challenges in the implementation, the UK tried to bring forward a unilateral solution. And I think that breached the trust. But the situation changed quite in a very important manner when we had the government led by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, and also the arrival of Foreign Secretary Cleverly and Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Heaton Harris. And very soon they decided that this was an issue that could be solved and addressed, and should be solved and addressed in cooperation and in discussions and dialogue with the European Union. And of course, on the European Union side, we were very keen to have that dialogue and to solve matters. And I think the teams got together, and I think in record time, looking very much at pragmatic issues and what the solutions could be, found solutions to those issues. I think it was done virtually in 3-4 months. So, and this has changed fundamentally the nature of the relationship and the understanding, I think, between the teams, both in London and Brussels, and has, I would say, opened a new phase in the relationship where we can look ahead jointly. We have a very solid base for building this relationship with the treaty, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and the Withdrawal Agreement, on which to build a new relationship. And that's where we want to head and where we're heading off right now, because the trust has been reestablished.
Thank you, Pedro. And Lindsay, how do you take that?
I think that's right. I mean, not necessarily the bit about how all the disagreements started, because as you can imagine, everyone sees that a bit differently. I mean, I think there's a few factors, though. I mean, one is just the passing of time. I mean, there's been a while since Brexit. Everyone's got a bit more used to it. Second big thing, I think, is the war in Ukraine, where we all discovered, which shouldn't have been a surprise, but I think to some it was a bit of a surprise, that of course we share fundamentally the same values. Also, as time has passed, people have realized that there isn't a sort of undercutting the EU agenda going on in the UK. There's a sort of smart regulation agenda, and it isn't perhaps as stark as people thought it would be. And then I think you add to that positive political relationships over the last 6 months or a year, the decision by Liz Truss to go to the European political community, the kind of increasing levels of conversation that there've been, all of that I think has helped a lot. But I do think that both sides then decided that they were going to each run some political risks to try and resolve the Windsor framework and resolve what was a kind of gaping set of problems around Northern Ireland, whatever the reasons for those problems originally. And I think the way that you build trust, particularly for politicians, is you show you're going to stick to what you said you would do. And you show that you're prepared to take risks and do things that are difficult politically. And I think that our Prime Minister, I think the Foreign Secretary and the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland were all very clear with their interlocutors that they were prepared to do that. And I think that Maroš Šefčovič and President von der Leyen were equally clear the other way around. And that's, I think, where we've got to an agreement that I think will work better for everyone.
Right. Well, let's move on then to the Windsor framework. I mean, not to be a spoil sport or throw cold water on this new sense of euphoria almost, but to what extent, well, first on a practical note, both of you, what are the issues now in implementation of the framework? And linked to that, is there a danger, again, without being too much of a killjoy, that we are overstating its importance and its impact on future EU-UK relations? Pedro, to you, what are the challenges now? What are the features of the implementation of the framework that we need to focus on and be maybe more aware of than we are now?
Well, it is a complex agreement. It has many sides to it and aspects, very technical aspects, and requires actually development through additional regulations, both on the EU side and on the UK side. And I think we have both embarked in this exercise. Most recently, I think the European Union put forward regulations on tariff rate quota for steel, phytosanitary, on medicines as well. And there are more to come. And of course, on the UK side as well, there are a number of things that need to be put in place, including which is related to labeling, a trusted trader scheme, recommendations on customs and data sharing. So there are a number of implementing actions that have to take place. I think they're taking place on both sides, and then of course the agreement will have to start playing fully its role, and I think that's the way we're heading. I don't want the Windsor framework is not the EU-UK relationship, and that's also very important. And I think Lindsay was referring to the broadness of the relationship and the importance of it. And certainly the war in Ukraine has made it very clear that we have to stick together and work together, which we have been doing actually since the war started, even before that war started. So the cooperation on Ukraine started way ahead of a solution to the Windsor framework. But the Windsor framework has symbolized a regain of trust and finding solutions to a problem that was originated in the Brexit process, a problem that affects also one member state very specifically, which is Ireland, in addition to the UK, and a problem that could, if not solved and addressed, could endanger the Belfast and Good Friday Agreement, which we all, of course, want to protect. And the European Union has been engaged in this in a very important manner. But we have managed to find, again, practical solutions to very specific problem issues, and now we have to implement all the legislative acts that are necessary to make this work.
Right. Okay, Lindsay. So you heard Pedro say that the Windsor framework is not just the UK relationship with the EU. That relationship is much broader, but it's clearly unlocked a new spirit of cooperation and goodwill. You said just now, very intriguingly, in the UK side in particular, but maybe also the EU side, they were prepared to take risks. So what kind of risks were they, and what light went off in somebody's head to say now is the moment to unblock this and take risks, which is not normally what politicians, certainly diplomats, do normally.
So I think the big thing for the politicians on both sides was improving what was actually going on in Northern Ireland, where I think the Vice President and the President of the Commission were always very clear that they really did want something that would work in Northern Ireland. And on our side, I mean, it was challenging within the UK Parliament to kind of bring forward a new agreement on Northern Ireland. That's not straightforward. There was quite a lot of support within the UK Parliament for it. But obviously we need to do a lot and still need to do a lot to build trust in Northern Ireland that this will be the right solution for Northern Ireland. I think the thing that makes it different is that politicians were approaching it looking for a solution that worked for both sides. And, I really think the Commission and the EU showed a lot of flexibility about the things that were most important to us. We tried to show a similar level of flexibility back about the issues that were important to the EU in terms of protection of the single market, where we recognise that there are significant challenges that the UK and in Northern Ireland we need to show that we're very vigilant about that. The reason I think it will work, put crudely, is because I think it creates incentives on both sides for the two sides to cooperate. There are facilitations and there are conditions around their facilitation. And there's a lot of technical work, and certain things only happen when the technical work's completed. And I think that's a good process of building trust. I think it was very hard, actually, for the original negotiators of the protocol to be clear exactly how the protocol would impact on Northern Ireland, because nobody had ever done anything like this before. And some of those impacts, I think we reached a shared conclusion, and Maros Šefčovič's non-papers quite early in the process were an important part of that there were some very real problems here that didn't have to work that way. And I think it's that spirit that characterized the politicians who took this forward.
Okay, I want to ask you both briefly about this issue, which has come out a lot this morning, starting Maros Šefčovič, the TCA review. There seem to be slightly different interpretations of what this actually means. Is it to you put it crudely, a mere but important box-ticking exercise on the implementation of the TCA until the moment when the review takes place? Or is it something which could be, with a bit of creativity, be used as an opportunity to think more creatively about the future relationship? Pedro, what is your take, as they say, about the TCA review? And before you, maybe to be fair to you, just to tell you that this morning the Vice President of the Commission said it would be a review maybe starting in 2026, but rather getting too hung up on the review itself, we should maybe use some of the existing vehicles and the procedures that set out in the TCA and even the withdrawal agreement, just so you don't go blindly against what your Vice President was saying this morning.
Thank you. No, I'll try not to do that. And definitely the trade and cooperation agreement, together with the withdrawal agreement, are the basis on which we're building this new relationship with the United Kingdom. And therefore, they are vital instruments. But the trade and cooperation agreement, the TCA, has had a relatively short life up to now. It's about 2 years in implementation. And those 2 years have been complicated as well. And we see that some of the elements of the TCA are starting to, let's say, breathe more easily now, once we've been able to overcome some of the difficulties we had, and notably around the Northern Ireland Protocol. So we are in early days of the TCA. It's a very, probably one of the most ambitious free trade agreements the European Union has and ever has had. And it has a lot of potential that we're still discovering. Only recently we are about to agree, I hope, on an MOU establishing a financial regulatory forum for dialogue. We have open now as well the possibility or to start discussing cooperation on Horizon and other programs. And like that, many other issues that are only starting to unfold now. So I think, as my Vice President said this morning, we have still a lot of potential to develop, and we still have close to 3 years before the review, and we'll see what that review brings and how we value and assess what this treaty is bringing to the relationship and allowing us to fulfill what we want to be a very strong relationship with the United Kingdom.
And therefore, for you, Lindsay, from the UK point of view, is the TCA review, the clue is in the title, a review of the implementation, or could it potentially, from the UK's point of view, be used as a part of a strategy for more fruitful engagement or deeper engagement with the European Union?
Well, I mean, it's of course it's just a review, as first of all the Vice President and then Stefan said. I mean, nobody's pretending it's anything other than a review. The question is what you do after you've reviewed something. And, you know, I think, again, what Stefan Furing was right about is, of course, if the EU and the UK wanted to do anything really significant to change the agreement, you'd need a full treaty review process. But there is real potential in the TCA. I mean, you know, for example, there is the potential to amend rules of origin within the TCA if that's what both sides want to do. Stefan was equally clear this morning that you know, the EU will look very carefully at whether those kind of changes are in its interest, and of course that's perfectly reasonable. I mean, we've got some bits of potential which we're now working on because they were frozen for a couple of years, and so it's certainly true that there's quite a lot of work to do over the next 6 months. That's the MOU on financial services, the cyber dialogue, but there are ways of using the existing TCA. And then, of course, we could have a discussion in the future about whether there are changes that both sides want to make to the TCA, and indeed parts of the TCA which need to be developed. I think that the last couple of years have shown that there are quite a lot of subjects we need to discuss, without prejudice to then the instruments we use to fix or ensure that we don't end up unnecessarily on the wrong side of issues. Anybody who watched, and those of us who lived through the vaccine stuff, would tell you that a dialogue on kind of regulation of vaccines can be in both sides' interest, because obviously we have complex supply chains that interact there, and nobody wants to get to a position where you're undermining vaccine supply, for example. Similarly, we've got there's a lot of work to do in the TCA on the subject of electricity trading, which the two sides are taking forward technically at the moment. But what the last year or two has shown is that we do need to talk a lot also about energy security. And that's because simply the challenges around energy security are more significant now than any of us even imagined at the time that we were negotiating the TCA. So I think there's a grown-up discussion to be had, and it could be in and around the review, it could be earlier, it could be later, about whether both sides what they want to put around the TCA. And that could include changes to the TCA, obviously, but any change to the TCA that the Partnership Council was not empowered to make itself would take the EU at least to a pretty complicated negotiation and treaty ratification process. And the EU is, understandably cautious to enter into those dynamics. I mean, traditionally what the EU does with FTAs is not very much with them. And I think that doesn't really, in this case, reflect the complexity and breadth of the dynamic relationship that exists. But equally, the EU, in considering whether to look at any changes to the TCA or whether anything needs to be improved within the mechanisms of the TCA, it'll look very carefully at what's in it for its relationship with the UK, but also how that then compares to its global positioning on free trade agreements, where quite a few of the positions that the EU takes are positions that they take in a number of free trade agreement contexts. So I think there is quite a lot of opportunity, but we'll obviously have to show that using the opportunity, whether inside or beyond the FTA, would really be in both sides' interests. And the EU, as quite a large regulatory area, is going to ask some quite hard questions about that in the build-up to the review.
Thank you, Lindsay. Pedro, you mentioned just now Horizon Europe, the famous flagship science program of the EU. Very briefly, on a point of information to both of you, I know many people watching and listening in now will want to know, where on earth do we stand now on the Horizon Europe UK participation negotiations, and how close to a deal or how close to a collapse in negotiations are we? Question to both of you. I hope you agree on your answers. Pedro.
Well, thank you so much. The president of the commission was very clear and opened the participation in programs, notably Horizon, but also Galileo and so also in the Euratom. That she did on the day that she was signing up to the Windsor framework with Prime Minister Sunak. And we have followed on that. And then actually teams have been meeting and discussing the implementation and the signing of the MOU and the launching of these cooperation. That, from our viewpoint, is extremely interesting. We think we have one of the most ambitious and forward-looking research programs anywhere. And ever since I arrived here at the UK, any university or even when I meet also business members of the business community, they all insist very much on the importance of the UK being able to participate in this program. So I think there's a real interest as well on the UK side. We were very clear, and then from the outset, that of course no one would be expecting that the UK needs to pay for the years in which it has not been able to participate in those programs. That was made very clear from the outset. Then the UK has been indicating that it wants to ensure it has value for money. And I think that's the discussion that is being had, rather in quite technical terms. And the discussion is continuing. We believe, of course, that there's a lot of value for money in what is being offered by participating in such a unique research program. And of course, we would be very happy if the UK, which has always contributed in a very important way to these programs in the past, would continue being part of it. And we hope the discussions will continue and will come to fruition.
So, and Lindsay, are we inching centimetering towards a solution in a not too distant future?
I hope so. I mean, we're very clear that we would prefer to associate with Horizon. And as Pedro says, it's not just Horizon. There's actually Euratom, and there is Copernicus, is the third program. But the challenge is that it isn't just a matter of not being in the first 2 years. It's also that if you're not in the first 2 years or 2.5 years, you obviously start from a relatively low base thereafter. So the question is, as Pedro says, how can you get back to a reasonable value for money? Because obviously participating in Horizon would be a massive part of our science budget. So what we can't afford to do is participate in Horizon, discover that UK participation rates remain very low, as they are projected to do, at least at the start, and not be able to get a reasonable return on the science budget that we're investing in it. But as Pedro says, we're having some good discussions with the EU side, and I think there's a good understanding on both sides about the problems that we're trying to solve. And as with the Windsor framework, that's really the key with negotiations. If you're both engaged in the search for solutions to the same problems, then with a bit of goodwill, which there definitely is on this, on both sides, then hopefully we'll get there.
All right. Well, Pedro, you heard just now Lindsay mentioned en passant this new European political community that's gathering. I think it's 47 now European countries, which have met now a couple of times, most recently in Moldova. As you know better than I do, Pedro, there's a lot of suspicion out there and cynicism about what this EPC, as it's called, is all about. We haven't got time to talk about all the different varieties of suspicion and cynicism, but on the UK side, it is not a secret that the UK almost demanded, Lindsay could put me straight if I'm overstating this, as a condition for taking part in the first meeting, the relatively low, should we say, low-profile presence of the EU and the institutions. Do you, from the EU perspective, Pedro, do you think that the EPC is something which the institutions, the EU themselves, the EU itself, rather than key member states, should be concerned about? Is it something might be potentially in competition with what the EU does every day, or is it something to, at some point, the EU has to come around and embrace what the EPC seeks to achieve?
Well, I think the EU is a full member of the EPC and participates with not only its two presidents, but also the High Representative Vice President. So its participation in the EPC is not negligible. And this responds very much as well to other formats of participation of the European Union with other groupings, be it in the G7, G20, where the EU participates in its own right and with its own flag, in addition to member states participating. So it's not something that is outlandish. It's something that we have done and tried before. In addition, this is a community of countries that is very close to the European Union, and where no doubt if there are going to be operational outcomes at some of these meetings, the European Union is going to be instrumental in its implementation, because out of 44 participants, well, 27 are member states of the European Union. In any kind of implementation of decisions, the EU will be obviously a vertebral column in bringing those decisions forward. So we are participating as EU, I think, with a lot of confidence and interest in this group of countries. It's what we would call our family, an enlarged family. And we see, I think, the presidents, and I want to speak for, I cannot speak for the presidents, but I've seen from the outside, rather, as a poor ambassador looking at these things, that there's a lot of added value, that this is appreciated and valued very much by the European Union as such. I don't see any issue on this, really. Thank you.
Right. So similarly, Lindsay, but so what does the UK, why does the UK clearly, it's not a secret, attach so much importance to the EPC? And can you give us a hint of what you're going to be doing when you host the meeting in the first half of next year in the United Kingdom?
Absolutely. Well, first on sort of where the EPC came from. I mean, for us from the beginning, we were assured that it was an intergovernmental initiative. Now, of course, we absolutely understand, therefore, that at the EU end, the EU has to do things. The 27 can't just go and do things by themselves without the EU institutions. And therefore, from an EU perspective, it's very important that the EU institutions are there. And also for us, as a non-EU member state who wants to cooperate with the EU and its member states, it's very important that the EU institutions are there. We don't want it to become a sort of an enlarged version of the European Union, or a sort of outer ring or anything like that. And we were clear about that from the start. The good thing is, I don't think anybody else really wants that either. What people value about it is the kind of bilateral discussions. We used the inaugural one in Prague to take forward work on the North Sea's energy community, the Calais group, work on migration. You can do a lot in the margins of the EPC. It's also, I think, been pretty good in terms of sending a very, very clear signal of European unity over Ukraine. And obviously the meeting in Moldova was particularly sort of symbolic from that perspective. And it was great that President Zelensky could be there. In terms of what we want out of it, well, what we think it's a useful forum. So to sustain the kind of energy and enthusiasm around it, we think heads of state are going to need to see that it's helping them deliver on their big objectives, whether that's regionally or whether it's across all 44 countries. Obviously, that can be useful in terms of some regional diplomacy. We saw that at the last one around the Balkans or around Azerbaijan, Armenia. But also we have to be clear that it's addressing the kind of headline challenges for the European continent. And for us, it's always been very clear that those include security, and obviously Russia, Ukraine has been a very big part of that. Also migration, where every country in the European landmass is facing challenges around migration. We need to find ways to work together on that. That, I think, in the EPC context will mainly be about ensuring that we're tackling the upstream challenges in the right way and working together to tackle organized crime. It's not intended to be a sort of institutional framework for that, but it is, it's just a critical challenge for Europe. And the third, obviously, is kind of energy and infrastructure and the issues around that. So for us to kind of, if the forum's going to remain relevant, it's obviously got to deal with real subjects. It's also got to retain this strong bilateral element and the strong intergovernmental element. So I think you will see all of those things building on what's been achieved so far. All of those things will characterize the way we approach it in the UK.
Okay. Well, the final question to both of you, the time has just flown by. And I'd like to circle back to the initial discussion we had about trust and what we call, trust building initiatives, trust building exercises. We all know that historically the UK has been, in the context of EU-UK relations, pretty allergic to anything which smacked of structured cooperation, and certainly in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit referendum 7 years ago. But I just wonder now from both of you, given world affairs, not least, of course, Ukraine, there's much more scope now, from your perspectives, gentlemen, for, without getting too bureaucratic, obviously, more structured dialogues, more structured initiatives where the two sides come together. As a very useful side product of which, of course, there's even more trust being generated, because by the sheer frequency and the reflex of coming together on a more systematic, albeit maybe even strategic basis. So what scope do you see, in very broad terms, Pedro, of more structured cooperation, the two sides, from going forward from now on?
On foreign and security policy, you refer essentially.
Yeah.
And I would replace the word structured by regular.
Okay.
Again, we offered, as you know, and it was in the political declaration, full cooperation on security and foreign policy, security and defense matters. And at the time, it was not picked up. In reality, we are having a very regular and intense cooperation on all these matters, and certainly the reality, imposes itself on any kind of things that administrations or persons may see one way or another. And the reality is that we need to work together, and that we benefit from working together in facing one of the most terrible challenges that I think the world has faced almost since, or certainly Europe, since the Second World War, in the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And we have come together, and we've been working together since day one, and sharing intelligence and preparing sanctions, coordinating as well military support to Ukraine, diplomatic support, humanitarian support, financial support. We will be having the conference on the reconstruction for Ukraine in a few days in London. And in all these matters, we've been working very closely together. We've seen more requests and interest on some of the programs that the European Union has been developing lately, notably in terms of defense capability development and support to partners in defense matters. And again, I think the response has been an open response from the EU side. Most of the programs and projects that we have on these areas have opening to participation of non-EU countries, and so we're keen to explore that if the UK does want to. And I think there had been good exchanges at the highest official level. Very recently, the permanent secretary of the Foreign Office was in Brussels, meeting with the Secretary General of the External Action Service, and there's already a certain regularity actually in those meetings. And Stefano Sandino was here a few months earlier, and probably they will meet again in a few months here in London. And we're seeing more and more also managing directors from the EAS coming here, and also directors from Foreign Office traveling to Brussels and exchanging with their colleagues and exchanging over the phone as well. So I think we are, I wouldn't call it structured, but I would call it rather intensifying or intense already exchanges, which is what should be between countries and groups of countries and international actors that are facing together in a brotherly and as allies a huge challenge in Europe. And of course, beyond the European continent, we have, of course, the exchanges as well on other challenges, be it in the Indo-Pacific as elsewhere throughout the world. And I think this is advancing in a very pragmatic and natural way, I would say, more than in a deliberately structured and mandatory manner.
Well, I think we'll settle for that. Final word to you, Lindsay.
Well, I mean, obviously, for me, the great advantage of negotiating a structured relationship is it would give me something to do for months and months and months, keep me in a job. But I actually think the reality is working very well at the moment. We, as Pedro says, it really is very regular, and the Foreign Secretary talks regularly to the High Representative as well. And of course, we know that the Prime Minister talks to the President of the European Council and the President of the European Commission. So I think the actual business of foreign policy, whether it's in the G7 or it's around the G7 or it's bilaterally, if it's about Sudan, if it's about Russia, Ukraine, all of that really, really works very well indeed now. We've expressed kind of interest in some of the PESCO projects around military mobility. We've worked together tremendously closely on training Ukrainian forces, for example, where the EU has its CSDP mission. We work together in places like Somalia. Of course, our efforts and the EU's efforts are coordinated as far afield in places like Mozambique and, of course, in the Western Balkans. So there is genuinely good cooperation going on. And that, I think, is the priority for the immediate future. And I honestly think both sides are sort of quite comfortable with that for this sort of political cycle, if you see what I mean. I think it is where it is. And if people want to come and look at it again in a few years' time, a bit like the review of the TCA, then people can deal with it on their merits at that point. And, we can see on both sides that there are people who would like to turn it into more of a formal security pact. There are certainly voices on the EU side that would like to come back to some of the ideas of greater structure. But I think everyone is comfortable that we've probably overachieved what people were expecting 12 months ago. And I think that's a good way to continue in that space.
Well, thank you very much. We have to leave it there. Thank you both so much. And thank you particularly letting me to take part in this conversation that normally would have taken place behind closed doors, and letting several hundred people out there listen in, which has been a very intriguing maybe experience for many people out there. Thank you so much, gentlemen, and you are hereby liberated to go back to your desk and your day job. Thank you again.
Nice to see you, Pedro. Nice to see you, Paul.
Likewise. Bye-bye. Many thanks.
So I'm still here. I'm here to round off, but to say a bunch of thank yous to everybody. I really want to start with thanking my colleagues at Forum Europe and the UK Forum, who've done a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes to make this go pretty smoothly today, I have to admit, especially my colleague Rebecca Williams, who's done a fantastic job. The sponsors I mentioned early on in the day, MSD, City of London and Vodafone, all the speakers who accepted my invitation pretty quickly. Actually, I didn't have to do too much begging, which was very gratifying. And it was very nice that so many of you, several hundred people registered for today's event. As I said at the beginning, just to remind you, the proceedings of the discussion today will be available very shortly on our YouTube channel and on our website if you want to listen in again. I think there's been quite a lot of activity both in social media and more traditional media, so we'll see if that carries on for a while. That's also very gratifying. The forum belongs to all of you. We have this kind of event here around your conference. We do other webinars, we do other activities as well. And if you feel like dropping me a line, my email address is on the EUUK Forum website. Any ideas you have and any words of encouragement also, or even a criticism, how we could do things better in the future. That's it from me. Thank you again for everybody for being here and keeping me company, and see you soon. Bye-bye.